It's not easy being a Targaryen without a dragon, but it surely is 10 times more difficult to convince the casual viewer to watch a Game of Thrones spin-off show set during an era without any dragons. However, it seems like A Night of Seven Kingdoms has turned that bane into its boon, because the Dunc and Egg tale is not just heartwarming, but is also sweetly hilarious. As the second episode of the spin-off show goes on to continue the saga of Ser Duncan the Tall and his precocious squire Egg, we finally get to witness the beautiful camaraderie of their relationship. But as the episode edges towards its end and the first day of the tournament begins, Dunc becomes more determined than ever to prove his worth and make his mark as a true knight. Now, while the first episode adapted the first 2 issues of the Hedge Knight, the second one follows the 3rd issues whilst also making many notable changes in the adaptation. Of course, unlike other Game of Thrones spin-off shows, these changes were happily blessed by George R.R. Martin, which so far is a great sign. Having said that, let's discuss 10 books to screen differences that were made in the second episode of A Night of Seven Kingdoms.
Awake, my love, and rest in the shade,
The scandalous opening scene does not exist in the book. Seems like the show is trying to make it a ritual by opening with out-of-mind shocking scenes. If Ser Duncan the Tall's unceremonious crouch took you out, I'm sure you two handled the flashing of Sir Arlen of Penetree as a jump scare, because Lord knows I did. So the second episode of A Night of the Seven Kingdoms begins with Dunc recounting the life and virtues of his former knightly master, Sir Arlen of Penetree. The flashback sequences here not only offer more insights into what Dunc and Sir Arlen's travels were like together, but it also includes a bit more of Sir Arlen than I think any of us needed to see, as we were in full frontal nude scene revealing his massive genitals right after he spent the night with a prostitute. This is obviously not a detail that has been mentioned anywhere in the book, because the graphic novel has only ever painted Arlen as a kind man. I think the most we found out about his past from Dunc were the battles he fought for lords or the tourneys he participated in, but the show gives us a peek not only into the scandalous inches on Sir Arlen, but also of the kind of relationship Dunc shared with him as they jousted together or shared salt-hard beef on the rough roads. On the contrary, there was a page on the second issue of the graphic novel documenting how Sir Arlen told Dunc about the time he visited King's Landing with his grandfather as a child to see the last dragon during the reign of Aegon the Unlucky, who by the way was Daemon and Rhaenyra's son. Having said that, I can only imagine how whatever creative behind the scenes chuckled to themselves when they came up with the idea to have Sir Arlen so heroically endowed, completely out of nowhere. In the books, Dunc never goes to meet another knight after Sir Manfred Dondarrion. So after the very meme-worthy Sir Arlen scene, alongside his time with Dunc on the road together, it is eventually revealed that this montage which Dunc has been narrating was actually his attempt to refresh the memory of various different knights around the Tourney grounds, in the hopes that at least one of them would remember Sir Arlen. The whole montage cuts back to the present, right as Dunc was making his pitch to Leo Longthorn Tyrell. But just like Manfred Dondarrion, Longthorn also does not seem to remember any knight named Sir Arlen of Penetree. Honestly, I really liked how this particular sequence gave us an idea about what kind of a knight Sir Arlen really was, because clearly he was never keen on earning any gold or glory, had very few friends, and still made sure he was always a benefit to everyone around him. Well, none of this was ever mentioned in the book, even if there are certain details that were mostly mentioned by Dunc while he was speaking to Egg. Given what we've just seen in House of the Dragon and Game of Thrones, we know just how much political baggage usually comes with being a knight in Westeros, but Sir Arlen's more liberated status as a Hedge Knight is refreshing, and in its own way almost more honourable. Having said that, I do want to mention that one small but clever detail that really works is the use of salt beef. In the flashback where Dunc and Sir Arlen were sheltering under a tree from the rain, sharing this tough, unappetising meal, it was seemingly the last wholesome moment they had as squire and knight, because shortly after, Arlen caught a fever and passed away, and by the end of the episode we return to that same image with Dunc once again tearing into a piece of salt beef as he's sitting with Egg in front of the fire. I think it creates a quiet but effective bookend. Salt beef is hard to chew, dry, and more something you endure than enjoy, which makes it a fitting parallel to what Dunc is going through. The episode strips away any romantic ideas he may have had about the Tourney, because let's be real, the road ahead is unforgiving, and any success he achieves will demand real sacrifice. Like the meal itself, these lessons are bitter, difficult to swallow, and impossible to avoid. The introduction of Prince Aerion Targaryen is different in the book. So after the rather embarrassing encounter that Dunc has with the other High Lords, tries to convince Dunc that he should not be grovelling to the High Lords, since he himself was a knight. Before the conversation can wander too far, trumpets start blaring in order to announce the House Targaryen has arrived at Ashford Meadow. Naturally, Egg has an interesting reaction to the Dragon Lord's arrival, and promptly asks Dunc if he can head back to the camp instead of wandering the Tourney grounds anymore. That leaves Dunc alone to witness the arrival of the Targaryens, as Prince Baelor, an heir to the Iron Throne, his younger brother, Prince Maekar, and Maekar's son, Aerion Targaryen, who styles himself as the Bright Flame. Even though Baelor gets the biggest welcome, it's actually Aerion who makes the most striking entrance. As he dismounts his horse, Aerion assumes Dunc is a stable boy and tries to get him to tend his mount, before eventually insulting Dunc once he realises that he was a knight. Despite Aerion's unnervingly cold and entitled reason to Dunc, the Hedge Knight does not end up helping him with the prince's horse after it kicks a nearby stable hand in the face. Now, this particular scene does happen in the book, but instead of introducing Aerion, we simply see Dunc encounter a high-station knight of the Kingsguard, who commands him to tend to his horse. When Dunc ignores him, the knight wearing red repeats himself again, only for Dunc to sheepishly mention how he was not the stable boy. The knight in response calls him dumb, and once again asks Dunc to fetch him some wine and a pretty wench, which is exactly what Aerion Targaryen does in the show. This is when the book's version of the events. Dunc looks at the knight straight in the eye and declares that he was no serving man but a man with the honour to be a knight. The obnoxious knight from the Kingsguard then chastises Dunc by saying how knighthood has fallen on sad days, and then gives the same command to the next boy in sight. The only difference here is we actually see Dunc tending to the horse, and I honestly love how much a Knight of the Seven Kingdoms is leaning into Dunc's small kindnesses with animals. Having said that, in the book, Aerion Targaryen is actually introduced comparatively later, right during the first day of the tournament, where he arrives in style, and then defeats the most revered Sir Humphrey Harding in the worst possible manner by using his lance to stab the knight's horse. I think the book's introduction is much more intense because we see him as an undignified sport right away. Even Egg hated Aerion and was heartbroken to hear the cries of the poor horse after it was so brutally stabbed. In fact, the cheering crowd also fell silent at Aerion's sudden madness, thus immediately giving us a hint of just how insensitive his character really was. In the book, Dunc and Prince Baelor Targaryen's encounter is witnessed by a fuller room. So after the Targaryens entered the Ashford castle, Dunc follows some servants into the castle through a tunnel-like entrance, where he overhears that Maekar's son Daeron and Aegon are missing. This is when Lord Ashford's daughter comes up to tell him the same thing before calling him big and stupid and going on her own merry way, which does not happen in the book. Sadly, it's not long before Dunc is soon found out, especially since he's just a giant dude trying to hide behind a small doorframe, thus allowing Prince Maekar to spot him. As the prince commands Dunc to show himself, he comes into the meeting chamber where Prince Baelor asks his identity. After introducing himself, Dunc asks Baelor Targaryen himself if he remembers Ser Arlen of Pennytree, since Ser Arlen often told stories of a joust where he faced Baelor many years ago. The scene is absolutely line for line taken from the book, as Dunc second guesses Baelor's recollection that Ser Arlen broke 4 lances fighting the Dragon Prince rather than the 7 the old knight always claimed. Ultimately, Dunc manages to sway Baelor by recalling another of Ser Arlen's stories properly, where he defeated Daemon Lannister, who is more popularly known as the Grey Lion. After providing the correct answer, Prince Baelor vouches for Dunc, allowing him to enter the tournament's participation list. But the only people to witness the whole exchange was Maekar, Lord Ashford, and his Master of Games. Compared to that, in the book, the scene is actually witnessed by a full house with many lords present inside the main hall. On another note, Lord Ashford initially accuses Dunc of stealing Arlen's chalice and sword before Baelor allows him to present his case, which definitely does not happen in the show. Dunc's first encounter with Tanselle is different in the book. In the book, Dunc reaches Ashford Meadow 2 days before the tournament begins, and so we see him going through town twice on 2 different days. But in the show, he reaches 1 day before the first day of the tournament begins, even if he does go back into town a couple of times. Dunc meets Tanselle for the first time and commissions her to paint his chalice after meeting with Prince Baelor. But in the book, during the 2 times that Dunc visits the town fair and the pavilions, we see him admiring a tall woman with black hair and sharp features pulling at the strings of the puppets. Now in the show, the puppets were actually human-sized as they were being dragged around by men, but in the book the puppets are comparatively smaller, so they can be easily pulled by strings. Anyway, when Dunc first saw her on page, He thought that while the puppets were skillfully crafted and perfectly manipulated, the puppeteer was actually more admirable than the puppets. In fact, the first time around he wanted to toss a copper towards her, but he had none. Although during the second visit after Dunc sold his horse and was on his way to collect his armour, he stopped to admire Tanselle's beauty once again as she told the story of Sir Rylan. However, this time after the show was over, Dunc did toss her a copper coin whilst praising her show. He thought her smile was very sweet and that she was very pretty. Given how tall Tanselle was, Dunc even imagined that he would not have to kneel in order to kiss her, and he then mustered up the courage to ask her for drink a horn of ale with him or eat a sausage, but Tanselle politely declined the offer, saying she had another show. Eventually, after being turned away when he was leaving, Dunc realised he was being a fool, especially when he saw Tanselle laughing at him with another woman. Seeing that, Dunc decided that jousting should have been his priority list rather than kissing. So while Dunc commissions Tanselle to paint his chalice in the book as well, it was actually their second time meeting each other, unlike what we see in the show. Egg quick-saving Dunc from embarrassing himself in front of Tanselle is different in the book. So while commissioning to have his chalice repainted by Tanselle with a sigil of his own, Dunc starts to make conversation with her, and that is how we find that Tanselle paints all the puppets of the troupe after her uncle carves them. Followed by this, we witness a rather cute scene where Dunc stumbles over his words, while Egg looks mortified for him. After introducing himself as Duncan the Tall, there is a fun bit where Tanselle reveals that she was mocked by others as Tanselle too tall as a child, which gets Dunc to nearly say that she was just the right height for him, but instead Egg swoops in to rescue by mentioning that Dunc meant Tanselle was just the right height for puppets. Now in the book we do see Duncan stutter, but Egg only stands beside him, witnessing this embarrassing exchange, and instead Dunc saves himself the shame by mentioning the puppets at the last minute. I believe this is just another instance where the show took a bit of internal monologue from the book and blew it up into an awkward, cute bit of dialogue which makes Dunc, Egg and Tanselle all the more endearing. The tug-of-war scene does not exist in the book, so as Dunc and Egg engage in some charming banter as they watch people play tug-of-war, but soon are press-ganged into playing the game. Lionel Baratheon who asked Dunc if he would like to heed his call for war. This of course makes for a fun little scene where Lionel showboats, and all thanks to Dunc, the team ultimately wins. This man really aura farms at every moment, because in between the game we see Lionel let go of the rope for a drink, causing his side to slowly edge towards losing, only for Dunc to call the Lord by his name in order to get him back into the game. To be honest, I am so glad that we see Lionel Baratheon complete with the Tyrells in a game of pull the rope, because it resulted in such a fun, light-hearted scene. And if you too have been seeing the freaky Lionel and Dunc edits on the internet, you'll certainly understand the charm of Dunc familiarly calling a great lord by his first name, or Lionel wee-smacking Dunc's ass after winning the game. And of course none of this exists in the book, because in the source material we do not see Lionel until the first day of the tournament. That too for a short period of time where he dismounts great lords from their horse by intimidating them with his uncanny laugh. Dunc sells his horse much earlier in the book. So in the show we see Dunc come to terms with the fact that for buying new armour he needed money, which was only possible if he sells one of Ser Erlen's horse. In a rather short scene we find out that Sweetfoot is a gentle beast, and Dunc promises that if he wins the tournament he can come back and buy her again. He does not haggle with the master of horses and instead asks him to feed the horse some oats and an apple. This hits harder because the show has built up Dunc to be an animal lover, so leaving Sweetfoot behind is definitely difficult for him. But the book takes a rather different approach. Dunc remembers how Ser Erlen always told him the knight should never love a horse, so he initially reached out to the master of horses at Ashford to sell Sweetfoot even before he went to enter the tournament. But given how busy he was with the tourney, the master of horses suggested Dunc take Sweetfoot into town to a man called Henley. At first Henley calls Sweetfoot a fine-looking beast, but after Dunc asks for 3,000 silvers, he starts to point out mistakes. After a bit of a haggle in the book, Dunc with a heavy heart lets go of Sweetfoot for 750 silvers. Before leaving, he asks Henley to give Sweetfoot some oats and an apple at night, which was heartbreakingly sweet. We then see Dunc going back to the main ground to find Steely Pate to collect his armour in exchange for 600 silvers and Arlen's old armour. If you've read the book, you already know how optimistic Dunc seemed to be about being a knight, especially because he placed his order with Steely Pate even before he went to Plumber to register himself in the tournament. I still feel the show's rendition makes it much more intense impact, especially because Dunc never stops to think about knights never loving their horses. In the book, before Dunc and Egg exchange in friendly banter before the tournament begins. So in the book, after meeting Tanselle, Dunc and Egg hear the announcement of the first day of the tournament, with people flocking to see the joust. This is when Dunc begins to explain to the squire about how a tournament really works. But of course, Egg knows it all and cuts Dunc's sentence short to mention that if he was among the top 5 knights to win the tournament, perhaps he could give the crown of love and beauty to Tanselle instead of Lord Ashford's daughter. Dunc quickly shuds Egg's mockery by threatening him with a clout to the head, and then picks him up on his shoulders so both of them can get a good view of all the rounds. When Egg sets a good view of everyone, he immediately starts introducing everyone to Dunc, starting from the Tyrells to the Targaryen princes. In fact, he even alerts Dunc that he would not want to challenge Lord Leo Tyrell, and even if Dunc did not show, he intended to put the information to use. Compared to this in the show, Dunc and Egg get one last scene of bonding over some cider, which was not something that later liked since his cup had a bug in it. This is when horns blared to announce the beginning of the tourney, as it was time for a night joust. The first day of the Ashford Meadow tourney is much more intense in the books. So after the tournament in the show, Lord Ashford and the Targaryens take up their spot on the dais, overlooking the jousting field, whilst Dunc, Egg and all the rest of the people who want to watch the action unfold crowd up to the fences. This entire sequence was fantastic, from the introduction of larger-than-life characters like Lord Medgar Tully, Sir Humphrey Harding, Lionel Baratheon and Prince Baelor's son, Valar Targaryen, to the outrageous stunts the knights pull as they charge their horses at each other. I mean, I agree we have seen tourneys before in Game of Thrones and House of the Dragon, but this is the first time it has really felt like one captured the real thrills of what it would be like to actually be present at one of these events. However, Dunc and Egg have very different responses to the joust. While Egg loses his mind with excitement as he shouts and cheers on top of Dunc's shoulders, the tall knight starts to have a subtle panic attack. Despite everything he has been through, this is the moment where the reality of what he is about to face really hits Dunc. Now the scene is very different in the book, where Sir Humphrey Harding and Sir Humphrey Beesbury broke almost a dozen lances before facing one another. The small folk started calling this epic struggle the Battle of Humphrey, which ended with Harding throwing Beesbury off his horse. Apart from that, a one-eyed Sir Robin Riesling also lost his helm to Lord Leo Tyrell's lance. At one point in the book, Dunc even asks Egg who is the least dangerous amongst all the challengers, to which we found out that it was Prince Valar's foe, Lord Garwin. Of course, the prince won, but what really commandeered the attention of the small folk was Sir Lionel Baratheon's introduction, who had fought and won several matches. This is the moment we learn that Lionel will lose his booming laugh to knock his opponents off his game, and if the challengers wore any sort of crest on their help, he would deliberately strike it off and fling it into the crowd to humiliate them. Even then, it was Sir Humphrey Harding who had been humbled 14 nights that day, as opposed to Prince Valar, who was only jousting with undistinguished opponents and older knights. But the tables turned when Prince Aerion Targaryen walked onto the field. Initially, Dunc thought Aerion would challenge Valar's shield, but he chose Sir Humphrey Harding, and oh well, you already know how that ended, with Harding on the ground and his horse cried in agony after being stabbed by the silver-haired spoilt brat. That's how the first round ended in the books, with Dunc and Egg walking away after being horrified by what they'd just witnessed. Having said that, I do think the next round in the show might go on to be more intense, and I'm really eager to see how it all unfolds. Well, that brings us to the very end of this video. I love how this episode was riddled with Easter eggs, especially with Egg pretending to kill all the Blackfire bastards. Having said that, do let us know what your thoughts and opinions about the changes that were made from the source material.